Today we're sewing another great everyday summer piece. This is the Evelyn skirt by Chalk and Notch Patterns. There are a few views offered for this pattern that give you a couple length options, as well as the option to add elastic to your waistband instead of adding the front buttons. This pattern is perfect for all sewing levels. The skirt itself is only 3 pattern pieces. The remainder of your pieces are facings, interfacings, and the waistband pieces. So the entire perimeter of the skirt has a very nice and professional finish. There are a few items that I'm using in today's sew along that I don't usually use in the videos. To help me base the front waistband in place before I top stitched, I used stitch Witchery to fuse everything together instead of using pins. I also used Fray Check to seal the inside of my buttonholes, and I used a heat erasable pen to mark the placement of my buttons and buttonholes. And I've linked all of these items in the description below. I hope you join me today in sewing this simple and polished skirt. Let's get started. Apply interfacing to the wrong side of your right and left front slit facing pieces. Then we're going to finish the straight edges in our preferred method. I'm going to be using my serger. Apply interfacing to the wrong sides of your back hem facings and to the wrong sides of your left and right front hem facings. For the front hem facings, we're going to finish these front edges. And for each of these facing pieces, we're going to finish the top edges. Also interface the wrong sides of your front and back waistband facing pieces, and we'll be finishing those edges later on. Here are both of my back skirt pieces. I'm going to finish the center back edges as well as the side seams separately. And here are my left and right front skirt pieces, and I'm going to finish the side seams separately. Now that all of the side seams are finished, place your front and back pieces right sides together and pin the side seams. Sew the side seams with a 3/8 inch seam allowance and press your seams open. Now that the side seams are sewn, place your 2 back pieces right sides together and pin. Sew the center back seam with a 3/4 inch seam allowance and press the seam open. Place your slit facings right side up with the finished edges in the center. Then place your left and right hem facings right sides together with the bottom edges of the slit facings. Your shorter left hem facing will be on the right side. Pin in place along the vertical edge. Sew with a 3/8 inch seam allowance and press the seam allowances toward the hem facings. Place your back hem facings right sides together along the center back, matching the double notches and pin in place. Sew with a 3/4 inch seam allowance and press the seam open. Place your front and back hem facings right sides together along the side seams and pin. Sew with a 3/8 inch seam allowance and press the seams open. Now we can start attaching the slit facings and hem facings to the skirt. Start pinning at the top of the skirt and around the bottom hem corner, making sure to match up those side seams. Then continue pinning along the bottom, and then back up to the top of the skirt on the other side. Also matching up that center back seam. Then we'll sew as pinned with a 3/8 inch seam allowance from the top of one center front, all around the bottom edge, and then back up to the opposite center front. Now that those facings are attached, we're going to trim those seam allowances all the way around by about half. and then clip into those bottom curved corners. Careful not to clip through your stitching. Then we're going to press those seam allowances toward the facing all the way around. Then with those seam allowances pressed toward the facings and the facings opened out away from the garment, we're going to understitch. As you approach the bottom curves, your presser foot won't allow you to understitch all the way to the bottom of the curve, so go as far as you can, backstitch to secure, and then start a fresh set of stitches on the other side of the curve and continue understitching. Doing the same around both curves. And you're stitching at most 1/8 of an inch away from the original stitching line. Then we can turn our facings right side out and give all of those seams a good press. Now, working from the inside of the garment, we're going to pin the facings to the main body of the skirt, along the finished edges of our facings. Then we're going to sew the facing to the skirt all the way around, edge stitching close to the finished edges. I'm going to start constructing the waistband starting with the main pieces. I've chosen not to interface the main waistband pieces. I'm going to place these back waistband pieces right sides together and pin matching the triple notches. And I'll sew this center back seam with a 3/4 inch seam allowance and press the seam open. Then continuing with my remaining uninterfaced left and right front waistband pieces, I'll place them right sides together with the back piece, pin the side seams, and sew those side seams with a 3/8 inch seam allowance and press the seams open. And I'll repeat to construct the interfaced waistband facing pieces. Now for the main waistband facing only, I'm going to fold the bottom raw edge to the wrong side by 3/8 of an inch all the way across the bottom edge. Now I'll place these waistband pieces right sides together and pin along the outer and top edge. Then I'll sew the 3/8 inch seam allowance from one side all the way to the other. Trim that seam allowance by about half. And I'll clip into those curved corners just as we did earlier for the bottom of the hem. Then we're going to press those seam allowances toward the facing, and we'll understitch that seam allowance just as we did earlier for the other facings. Starting and stopping the understitching around the curved corners, and sewing at most 1/8 of an inch away from the original stitching line. Now we can place those waistband pieces wrong sides together and poke out those corners. And give the waistband a good press. Pin the right side of the waistband facing to the wrong side of the skirt at the waistline. Match your notches and seams and pin in place. Sew the waistband facing to the top of the skirt with a 3/8 inch seam allowance from one side to the other. Now that the waistband is attached, press that seam allowance up toward the waistband. Now we're going to take that pre-pressed folded edge of the waistband, place it over the stitching line that we just created, and pin in place from one side to the other. To avoid pinning here, I'm going to be using Stitch Witchery to fuse that hem in place. Just applying this hem tape in between the fabric layers and fusing in place with the iron. Now that that bottom folded edge is held in place with a Stitch Witchery or with pins, Take it to the sewing machine and sew from the bottom folded edge with 1/8 of an inch seam allowance, all the way across to the opposite bottom folded edge of the facing. I've marked the placement of the buttonholes using a heat erasable pen and also using the buttonhole placement guide pattern piece. Now I'll sew my 7 buttonholes in place. Then I'm going to open the buttonholes, leaving the last 3 buttonholes closed. And I'll use Fray Check to seal the inner edges of those buttonholes. Now I'll place the front skirt with the buttonholes over the left side of the skirt, positioning those plackets over each other, and pinning the bottom edges of the skirts together at those 3 last buttonholes. Then I'm going to sew the 2 front skirts together along the bottom edge, sewing through each of the bottom 3 buttonholes. Then I'll use my button placement guide pattern piece to mark where the buttons will go on the opposite side of the buttonholes for your remaining buttonholes. Then I'll hand sew each of the buttons in place at the markings. Also sew the bottom 3 buttons in place, in line with the upper buttons, sewing through both attached layers of fabric. And now your skirt is complete. Thank you for watching this sew-along. Make sure you subscribe to the channel so you don't miss notifications every time there's a new full-length sew-along. And I'll see you in the next video.